Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll get your top stories from India and the region. I am Tanvi Taneja, and for news from the rest of the world, I'm joined by my colleague in Washington, D.C., Caroline Malone. Good to see you, Caroline.
Good morning, Tanvi. It's 10 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. and 3 in the afternoon across Central Europe. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, more on a devastating attack in Dagestan region of Russia and the reaction from officials there. But first, the headlines.
European Union approves plan to use 1.4 billion euros in profits from Russian frozen assets for Ukraine aid, despite Hungarian objection. Vladimir Putin expresses deepest condolences to the victims of Dagestan and Crimea attacks. Kremlin blames the United States for the barbaric missile attack on Crimea. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and members of his Council of Ministers take oath on the first day of the 18th Lok Sabha in New Delhi. And French President Emmanuel Macron meets Jordan's King Abdullah II in Paris. Gaza conflict set to be discussed. So up first, news from the EU foreign ministers meet in Luxembourg. The EU on Monday approved a plan to use 1.4 billion euros in profits from Russian frozen assets for Ukrainian aid, despite objection from Hungary. The EU also adopted a 14th package of sanctions on Russia, hitting the country's gas exports for the first time. A report.
The European Union on Monday adopted a 14th package of sanctions on Russia that aims to close some circumvention loopholes. It hits Russia's gas exports for the first time. Western powers imposed sweeping sanctions on Moscow after the Russia-Ukraine conflict broke out in February 2022, which has been progressively ramped up since. The package will add 116 entities and individuals to the sanctions list, bringing the total to more than 2,200. The new restrictions on gas aim to reduce Russia's revenues from liquefied natural gas exports by banning transshipments of EU ports and a clause allowing Sweden and Finland to cancel some LNG contracts. The measures stop short of an EU ban on LNG imports, which have risen since the start of the conflict. The sanctions will take effect after a 9-month transition period. The package also prohibits new investments and services to complete LNG projects under construction in Russia. The EU will add 27 vessels to its list of sanctioned entities. It includes oil and liquefied natural gas tankers. The list also includes ships that have been transporting defense equipment for Russia. In a further move to hurt Moscow's ability to trade, the sanctions package bans EU banks outside Russia from using Moscow's financial messaging system, SFPS, its equivalent to the global payment system SWIFT. Western powers had banned Moscow from SWIFT in 2022. The EU also adopted sanctions against 6 people in Sudan over the war between the Sudanese military and the paramilitary rapid support forces that has engulfed the country. It includes officials from both Sudan's army and the paramilitary. Ahead of the talks, EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell said that he would put forward a proposal on how to avoid any member state blocking the use of proceeds from frozen Russian financial funds to support Ukraine.
We have these revenues coming from the frozen assets, and we have to look for a way in order to use them, avoiding any kind of blockage. We have a process in order to make this work quickly. The first tranche of money will come next week, or next week in July, yes. The second will come some month later. This money cannot get stuck. It has to be used. And we have a legal procedure in order to avoid any kind of blockage.
The EU foreign ministers had an informal exchange of views with Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba, via video conference. Bureau Report, DD India.
Tech giant Apple has been charged by the European Union antitrust regulators on Monday for breaching the bloc's tech rules, a charge that could result in a hefty fine for the iPhone maker. The EU's Digital Markets Act violations could result in a fine of as much as 10% of a company's global annual turnover. Apple also faces another investigation into new fees imposed on app developers. The European Commission, which is also the EU's antitrust and technology regulator, said that it had sent its preliminary findings to Apple following an investigation launched in March. European Union leaders have expressed concerns over the risk of a wider conflict in West Asia amid fresh threats from Hezbollah. This comes after Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah threatened EU member Cyprus for the first time and other parts of the Mediterranean. Greece has said that it stood by Cyprus amid global threats from terrorist organizations. So this foreign ministers meet of the European Union is underway in Luxembourg. So the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Gaza is set to be discussed as the EU sanctions have been approved by the European Union, and the funds, the profits from the frozen Russian funds will be utilized for Ukrainian aid. This is what EU Chief Joseph Borrell informed earlier in the day. And we're now joined by DD India's William Denslow. He's joining us from Brussels for more. William, how exactly will the plan to use frozen Russian assets work?
Well, Tanvi, this has been a huge sticking point, and it's really Hungary that has been the thorn in the side of Joseph Borrell, the EU's chief foreign affairs minister, and it seems that he has developed a workaround to circumvent some of the issues that Budapest has when it comes to the EU's continued demand to supply Ukraine with military humanitarian assistance going forward. Josep Borrell said at the start of this meeting being held in Luxembourg between EU foreign affairs ministers is that because Hungary essentially abstained from a vote on the matter earlier this year, he said that that didn't give Budapest the grounds to have a say this time around. So it seems that we could see some progress. This could be a green light potentially for the assets using some of the profits used from Russia's frozen assets to be used going forward. But this isn't the end of the dilemma. Russian sanctions need to be voted on every 6 months or so by the European Union, which will give Hungary plenty of opportunity in the future to still have their say when it comes to the EU's continued efforts to support Kiev.
William Denslow in Brussels, thank you for those updates. On to Russia now. In a deadly terror strike, unknown gunmen stormed a synagogue and a church in Russia's Dagestan region, leaving 19 people dead with several others injured. My colleague Caroline Malone is in Washington, D.C. She takes it forward from me here, gives us more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Caroline, Russia is seeing another terrorist attack in just 3 months after the attack in Moscow in March.
That's right, Tanvi. At least 19 people, including policemen, were killed as gunmen attacked synagogues and churches in Russia's Dagestan region on Sunday. The simultaneous attacks happened across the cities of Derbent and Makhachkala. 5 gunmen were also killed. Well, no group has yet claimed responsibility for the attacks, which take place 3 months after 145 people were killed in another attack claimed by the Islamic State group on a concert hall near Moscow.
Subsequent operational search and investigative measures will be carried out until all participants in these sleeper cells are identified. And of course, they had been preparing, including from abroad. I would like to ask all of you, dear Dagestanis, dear guests of the Republic, to remain calm. The situation is now under the control of the government authorities and law enforcement agencies.
Мы понимаем, какой цели организаторы пытались добиться.
Well, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has expressed his deepest condolences to the families of the victims of the Dagestan attacks. This comes as a Russian anti-terrorist committee and investigative committee are looking into what happened at the scene of the attacks. Well, earlier, Dagestan Governor Sergei Melkov visited the church and house where an Orthodox priest who was killed in the attack used to live. Melkov has called the incident a terror attack. Well, the region is also observing 3 days of mourning. Well, meanwhile, the Kremlin has blamed the United States for a Ukrainian attack on Crimea using tactical ballistic missiles that killed at least 4 people and injured over 150. They've said there would be consequences for what it called a barbaric attack.
We witnessed an absolutely barbaric missile attack in Crimea. We understand perfectly well who is behind this. The president last week repeatedly told about who is guiding towards target these technically complex missiles. It is not the Ukrainians who ensured these launches and so on. Everything is perfectly clear here. You, as representatives of media, need to ask my colleagues in Europe and especially in Washington, press secretaries, why their government are killing Russian children.
Well, meanwhile, at least 3 people were injured in a Russian strike on Ukraine's Odessa city on Monday. Earlier, several Russian strikes hit the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. At least 1 person was killed and 10 people were wounded in those attacks. The regional governor said a school was hit along with a private home where most of the casualties had occurred. The governor added that Russia appeared to have used glide bombs in the attack. Well, a top US general has warned of a wider conflict if Israel launches an offensive in Lebanon. This comes as tensions between Israel and Hezbollah continue to rise. While acknowledging Israel's right to defend itself, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff CQ Brown warned that a broader conflict could draw in Hezbollah's backer Iran. Well, last week, Hezbollah's chief Hassan Nasrallah said that nowhere in Israel would be safe if a full-fledged war breaks out between the two sides. Well, earlier, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that while the phase of intense fighting against Hamas in the Gaza Strip is coming to an end, that the conflict would not end until Hamas's rule in the Palestinian enclave has finished.
If there is an agreement, it will be an agreement according to our terms, and our terms are not to end the war, to leave Gaza and leave Hamas as it is. After the intense phase is finished, we will have the possibility to move part of the forces north, and we will do this, first and foremost for defensive purposes, and secondly, to bring our evacuated residents home.
Well, now on to the UK elections, and a scandal over bets placed on the date of the election continues to dominate the campaign trail. There are reports an investigation into betting by members of the Conservative Party is expanding, and the Conservatives have launched their own probe into the claims. Well, DD India's Ollie Barrett reports from London.
Rishi Sunak says that his Conservative Party is carrying out its own investigation into the growing scandal around bets being placed on the date of the snap election. He insists that he doesn't know of any further Conservative Party candidates being investigated by the regulator, the Gambling Commission, at this stage, and the Prime Minister says he himself is not under investigation, but he's still facing major criticism from the other parties. The Labour leader Keir Starmer says if he were a leader of a party which had candidates facing allegations like this, that he would suspend them. The Liberal Democrats have called for the Prime Minister's ethics advisor to investigate, but also to look into whether any cabinet ministers may have placed any bets on the date of the election. And this is all making the final couple of weeks of the election campaign very, very difficult indeed for a Conservative Party already trailing by some distance in the polls. All of the polls still have the Conservatives around 20 points or more behind Labour. So the Labour Party going into the final week and a bit of the campaign trail are doing everything they can to try and encourage their voters out on July the 4th when election day gets here. They are trying to urge against complacency and any of their potential supporters feeling that it is a done deal that Labour will win the election.
Well, France could see civil unrest and violence that is related to their elections. The Interior Minister Gerald Darmanin has warned on Monday as campaigning enters its last week before the first round of voting. Well, President Emmanuel Macron's party is on the ballot and the election is being seen as a referendum on the fate of the president. If a new French government under far-right leadership of the National Rally Party wins, they say they would break with decades of unfinanced spending traditions and try to stick more to European Union fiscal rules. Well, New Caledonian's jailed pro-independence leader Christian Tien has been extradited along with 6 other people. They've been accused of inciting violent protests in the French Pacific territory. Protesters had set fire to the town hall in the Kumak commune and destroyed areas in Pita. The protest began in May this year after a French reform vote that would have allowed residents of the territory more voting rights. Well, DD India's Russ Cullen joins us now live from Paris with more on that story. So, Russ, what is the latest on this situation?
Yeah, it's maybe not an extradition, but it is what the French government would see as an internal transfer, that these independence activists are being moved from the overseas territory to the mainland here in France. But according to one of the lawyers for one of the militant activists, he has said it is a, quote, a true uprooting, being moved and not being held in pre-trial custody on the island, on the French Pacific territory, but instead being moved the 17,000 kilometres away back here to the French mainland. This is all to do with the original unrest. 8 people died in the disorder earlier in the year when we did see the reaction to the French government's plan to suggest there should be reform of the constitution to be able to allow French residents on the island who've been living there for at least 10 years to be able to vote in local elections. And the indigenous population, native New Caledonians, felt that that would dilute their vote if large numbers of French residents from mainland France moved to the island and started voting in local elections. We saw a real breakout of rioting, looting and general disorder. Thousands of extra troops from the armed forces and extra police officers had to be sent to the island to try to contain the disturbances. The French President Emmanuel Macron went there with his Interior Minister himself to try to calm the tensions on the island. And just in relation to your previous story, the French election, during the campaign, President Macron has said that for the moment that idea of constitutional reform affecting New Caledonia is off the table, so he's also tried to calm tensions that way.
Thank you, Ross. That was Ross Cullen reporting live from Paris. Well, French President Emmanuel Macron has welcomed Jordan's King Abdullah II and Queen Rania to Paris on Monday. The two leaders are set to discuss the situation in Gaza with a focus on achieving a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and the delivery of humanitarian aid and the freeing of hostages. Well, this meeting follows a previous visit to Paris in February. Well, that's it from me here in Washington, D.C. Back to you in the studio, Tanvi.
Thank you, Caroline. Caroline Malone joining us all from Washington, D.C. You're watching DD India Global. Next, news from Asia. China's foreign ministry on Monday urged the Philippines to stop its infringements and provocations amid the two countries' ongoing disputed waters issue in the South China Sea. In response to a question regarding a recent confrontation between the Chinese Coast Guard and the Philippine Navy, The Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning said that China and the Philippines should work together to safeguard peace and stability in the South China Sea.
As for the incident of the Philippine ship illegally intruding into the waters adjacent to Renai Jiao, as you mentioned, the Chinese side has briefed you on the situation and clarified its position. Renai Jiao is a part of China's Nansha Islands and it is China's territory. The Philippine side should stop its infringements and provocations, return to the right track of properly handling maritime disputes through negotiation and consultation as soon as possible, and work with China to safeguard peace and stability in the South China Sea.
Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te put out a statement calling China an autocracy as real evil after China threatened to impose death penalty to die-hard Taiwan independence activists, calling them separatists. Lai Ching-te added, China has no right to sanction Taiwanese people.
I also want to call on China to face up to the existence of the Republic of China and have exchanges and dialogue with Taiwan's democratically elected legitimate government. This is the only correct way to increase the welfare of people on both sides of the strait. If this is not done, relations between Taiwan and China will only become more and more estranged.
And on to New Delhi now. The first session of India's lower house of parliament after the 2024 general elections began on Monday and it has been adjourned for the day. The session began with the observance of silence, marking the solemn occasion of the first sitting of the 18th Lok Sabha. Earlier, Prime Minister Narendra Modi took oath as the member of parliament of the 18th Lok Sabha. This is the third term of Prime Minister Modi as a member of the Lok Sabha. He retained the Varanasi seat in the general elections, which he has been winning since 2014. As leader of the House, he was the first one to take oath today. Pro Tem Speaker Bhartahari Mehtab administered the oath of office to Prime Minister Modi. Union Ministers Amit Shah, Rajnath Singh, Shivraj Singh Chauhan, Nitin Gadkari, Manohar Lal, Piyush Goyal and other members took oath as members of the Lok Sabha. Addressing media ahead of the session, the Indian Prime Minister said that the government will work 3 times harder in the third term, underlining the 50th anniversary of the emergency. He called the period a blot on Indian democracy.
जो लोग भारत की लोकतांत्रिक परंपराओं पे निष्ठा रखते हैं, उनके लिए 25 जून न भूलने वाला दिवस है। कल 25 जून को भारत के लोकतंत्र में जो काला धब्बा लगा था, उसके 50 वर्ष हो रहे हैं। भारत की नई पीढ़ी इस बात को कभी नहीं भूलेगी कि भारत के संविधान को पूरी तरह नकार दिया गया था, देश को जेल खाना बना दिया गया था, लोकतंत्र को पूरी तरह दबोच दिया गया था। इमरजेंसी के ये 50 साल इस संकल्प के हैं कि हम गौरव के साथ हमारे संविधान की रक्षा करते हुए भारत के लोकतांत्रिक परंपराओं की रक्षा करते हुए देशवासी संकल्प लेंगे कि भारत में फिर कभी कोई ऐसी हिम्मत नहीं करेगा जो 50 साल पहले की गई थी और लोकतंत्र पे काला धब्बा लगा दिया गया था।
And DD India's Dibendu Mondal joins us live on the story from New Delhi. Dibendu, what have been the key developments of the first day of the 18th Lok Sabha?
Well, Tanvi, if you look, today was the inaugural session of the 18th Lok Sabha. It was the first sitting where all the member of parliaments were administered oath by the pro tem speaker, and the pro tem speaker was in turn administered oath by the President of India. This is the first 2 days lined up in the parliament where all the newly elected parliamentarians will be taking oath. About 260 of them have taken oath today, including the cabinet ministers, the Prime Minister and his Council of Ministers. The oaths that are being administered are in alphabetical order with respect to the states. For example, it began with Assam and it will end with West Bengal. So of course, the first day and the first 2 days will of course be of the oath-taking ceremony of all the newly elected parliamentarians. Back to you.
This session is till July the 3rd. So what is expected during the first sitting of the 18th Lok Sabha in the days ahead?
Well, Tanvi, the first sitting of the 18th Lok Sabha is of course about 8 days session where the election of the Lok Sabha speaker will also happen. It will also witness the inaugural address by the President of India, who heads the Parliament. She will be addressing the joint session of Parliament expectedly on Thursday, after which the motion of thanks for the President's address will be put to debate in both the Houses of Parliament, which includes the Lok Sabha and as well as the Rajya Sabha, and the leader of the House, Prime Minister in case of the Lok Sabha, will put the motion of thanks and deliver the keynote address in the Parliament. This will also be followed by the leader of the opposition. So this is what it's just an inaugural session, Tanvi, where all the formalities, constitutional parliamentary democracy formalities will be carried out in the first session before the budget / the monsoon session begins later next month. Back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Dibyendu, for those updates. The Indian government on Monday imposed a stock limit on wheat until 31st of March 2025 across all states and union territories. The move will help manage the overall food security and prevent hoarding and unscrupulous speculation.
This year, we can say that the target has also increased. Last year, when the actual sown area was 285 hectare, this year the targeted area is 353.35. So, and this I am talking about the top 10 states. Other states who also contribute to the cultivation of onion will also be doing it. So this is also something which is very, very positive.
And next we have a report on gender inclusivity. Women bring immense benefits to diplomacy. Their leadership styles, expertise, priorities broaden the scope of issues under consideration and the quality of outcomes. Why we're telling you all this? Well, June 24th is observed as the International Day of Women in Diplomacy since 2022. An initiative by the United Nations General Assembly. It aims to make women's leadership more visible, acknowledge the achievements of women in the diplomatic sphere and highlight the journey still required to achieve full and equal participation of women in all areas of decision making and political life. So with that, it's a wrap in this edition of DD India Global. Do let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. Connect with us on our different social media handles at DD India Live. And for those on the go, you can catch all the latest news and updates on our DD India mobile app. The app is available on both Android and iOS platforms. We'll be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Tanvi Taneja from my entire team here in New Delhi. Thank you for watching. Namaskar.